Resilience in an Urban Park, the Recovery of Species Richness and Densities After Hurricane Juan, presented by Jovia,
Katie,
and Leaf.
Hurricanes are intense storms that form in the tropics. They are characterized by low atmospheric pressure, inward spiraling winds exceeding 120 kilometers an hour, and a central eye. These storms play a natural role and are an example of abiotic factors in forest dynamics by toppling older or weaker trees, particularly in areas exposed to strong winds. The frequency and intensity of hurricanes in the North Atlantic area have been increasing since the 1970s and are expected to rise further due to global warming. Urban parks improve air and water quality, reduce pollution, and enhance public health and well-being. Originating in the 19th century, they foster social cohesion and are now essential features of cities worldwide. National urban parks help cities address biodiversity loss and climate change through local solutions. They also promote Indigenous leadership and the integration of Indigenous knowledge, history, and culture, creating inclusive and culturally supportive spaces. In 2003, Category 2 Hurricane Juan struck the Nova Scotia coastline with sustained winds of 158 kilometers an hour and even higher speeds of gusts. Hurricane Juan was the most destructive storm to impact Halifax since 1893. The storm caused significant damage to woodlands across the central region of the province. The Mi'kmaq called the area from downtown Halifax to Point Pleasant Park Amtukati, meaning spirit place. According to the Mi'kmaq creation story, this is where the Great Spirit Fire sparked the birth of the 7 original Mi'kmaq families, later forming the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki. This deep spiritual connection contributed to their strong protection of the park. Mixed Acadian forests along the Atlantic coast have low diversity, likely due to harsh environmental conditions. Point Pleasant Park exhibits higher tree diversity, which can be explained by the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, suggesting that diversity is highest with moderate disturbance. Our goal is to assess the recovery of Point Pleasant Park following Hurricane Juan and develop strategies to enhance future restoration efforts for similar parks. Our predicted hypothesis is that the species density and species richness will increase significantly in the years following Hurricane Juan. Understanding how to support urban park recovery is crucial, as these spaces hold significant ecological, cultural, and community value. While hurricanes cannot directly be prevented, improving recovery strategies ensures the long-term resilience of parks like Point Pleasant.
Our key questions are, how has the park regenerated? Will it ever return to its original state? And what recovery efforts will we implement moving forward? Some key definitions and acronyms that may be useful to know. Replacing disturbance or stand replacing disturbance is an event that kills a large group of trees that is natural or human caused. Diameter at breast height, or DBH, refers to the tree diameter measured at 4.5 feet above the ground. Total density, or TD, represents the number of individuals per 400 meters squared, while species richness, S, indicates the total number of different species present. A climax community is a stable, mature ecosystem of plants, animals, and fungi that has developed over time, reaching the final stage of ecological succession for a specific climate and region. Succession is an ecological theory that describes how a community changes over time following a disturbance.
Since 2004, 4 to 6 sites in Point Pleasant Park have been surveyed annually, except in 2005, 2007, 2016, and 2020. Each site consisted of a 20 meter by 20 meter plot selected to represent the most affected areas of the park. Students used a field guide of common trees and ground flora species in Nova Scotia to identify organisms to the lowest possible taxon. All living trees with a DBH of 2.5 centimeters or greater were measured and identified. Within each study site, all living trees with a DBH were measured to the nearest millimeter using a 1 meter measuring tape and identified to genus or species. If multiple trunks grew from a single stump, only the largest trunk was recorded. To estimate the three-dimensional percentage cover of ground flora species, 10 to 12 wooden quadrats of 1 meter by 1 meter were placed haphazardly within each site. Haphazard placement was achieved by throwing a brightly colored object into the site, with its landing location serving as the quadrat center. Trees within the quadrat were excluded from the analysis. linear regression analysis was used for a statistical analysis and compared against an alpha of 0.05.
Following the destruction of vegetation in Point Pleasant Park by a hurricane in 2003, the total density of the forest community is seen to have increased over time, as seen on the slide. The data shows a positive linear trend in total density, which indicates moderate to low correlation in species density explained by time in 2024 compared to 2004. With a null hypothesis stating that the species density will not change in the years following Hurricane Juan, we reject the null hypotheses because there was a significant change in species density based on our p-value. In 2004, the total density was low, but as time passes, the density per 400 meter squares increases. This means that the overall density of the forest is recovering after the hurricane in Point Pleasant Park. As the overall community moves towards its climax community, we predict that it will eventually stabilize. This is because competition for light, nutrients, and space will increase as the forest becomes denser. This will lead to self-thinning, where weaker trees will die off and stronger individuals dominate. This means that the density and ecosystem structure of the forest will remain relatively unchanged until disturbed. The data shows that Point Pleasant Park has not yet reached their climax community and is probably in early to mid-succession. The density is still increasing as of 2024.
In 2004, the dominant species in Point Pleasant Park was the red spruce. Since the hurricane hit, the density of red spruce has increased slowly. Since the rate of increase in the density of red spruce is small, another species, the red maple, has since surpassed it and is now the current dominant species. Red maple has had a more rapid increase in density since 2004. Both species have increased their densities in the past 20 years. The red maple was simply faster and therefore managed to surpass the red spruce. The hurricane in 2003 wiped out 70,000 trees that were growing in the park, as well as a lot of other vegetation, especially in the sites that were chosen for this study. This means that there was plenty of resources, notably space, and a lack of competition for soil, nutrients, and light. Since then, plants have been growing again to fill up the gap that was left, profit from the available resources, and recover their populations to the numbers they were at before Hurricane Juan. One reason that would explain the rapid increase in red maples is that red maples are classified as an early successional tree. When a disturbance occurs in an area where conifers like red spruce are unable to regenerate right away, the early successional trees like red maples are more likely to take over and become established. As the forest moves towards its climax community, we predict that the density of the dominant species will stabilize, since the climax community represents a time of balance and equilibrium. The species will be at their carrying capacity for the moment, not leaving any room for more growth.
Let's look at how species richness in Point Pleasant Park has changed over time following the hurricane. As we can see in Figure 5, species richness has significantly increased over time and started to stabilize around 2017 at around 10 species per 400 meters squared. Why? This increase is primarily due to natural regeneration over time following the hurricane, allowing new species to establish and the ecosystem to recover. Additionally, a new management plan was implemented to foster a mixed-age Acadian forest with native tree and ground flora species. The plan emphasized promoting natural regeneration where possible and included an adaptive management approach involving close monitoring of the park and adjusting strategies as needed. Looking at what will happen to the species richness as the forest moves towards its climax community, we can predict that it will stabilize completely. From 2017 to 2024, it looks as though the species richness is starting to stabilize, so we are already on the way to reaching our climax community. Why is this? As succession progresses, competition among species will limit further increases in richness. Species will reach their carrying capacities as well. This will reduce the creation or addition of new species and can lead to a more stable community structure.
In conclusion, Point Pleasant Park currently appears to be in early/mid stages of succession. The forest has not yet fully recovered and stabilized after Hurricane Juan hit in 2003. There are still continual changes in the species richness, the density of certain species, and the overall densities. Being an urban park, Point Pleasant Park gets a lot of foot traffic, including a high volume of off-trail activity. This kind of human disturbance affects the quality of the soil by compacting it and reducing the fertility. Lower soil quality could make it harder to enter a late stage of succession and reach the climax ecosystem. Another downside of being an urban park is that humans selectively choose which trees should be allowed to grow in it. In 2019, workers cut down 80,000 trees in the park that were deemed too weak. By involving and using traditional knowledge from the First Nations, we can get a more complete understanding about how the interactions and relationships between the species and with abiotic elements of the ecosystem. This helps add a layer of depth to management plans and strategies.
In the future, to conserve forests and help our forests reach their climax community, a few precautions can be put in place. Clear paths will cause less foot traffic on the soil needed for different plants to grow. There could be more areas roped off to protect the forest. As well, there should be less human dictation on what trees get to survive and which ones get removed. This dictation is not helping our forests reach their climax community.
We think that the existence of neighboring climax forest communities is contributing to the process of succession at our study sites. The main benefit they bring is the dispersal ability. For a plant species to recover in an area after a disturbance, there needs to be a source of seeds. Having an established population nearby helps greatly, especially with trees that have large seeds that cannot be carried large distances by the wind. Having a large store of seeds that come from the same types of plants that inhibited the space before the disturbance also ensures that the ecosystem will return to a similar state to what it was before the disturbance. There are less chances for new or invasive species to take over. The old-growth forest nearby also provides shade that would not otherwise be there. This allows species that require shade to start growing and recovering right away after the disturbance instead of waiting until other plants grow large enough. With the seed bank nearby and some shade, the rate of succession and recovery is increased, and it will take less time for the impacted area to return to a late-stage succession.
We believe that the surrounding urban area influenced the progression of succession of this forest community greatly, and because of the surrounding area, the forest did recover differently than it would have elsewhere. Being in an urban environment means that there is a lot of human influence on how the forest grows, and plenty of dictation on what occurs, meaning that the forest does not go through its natural course of succession, and will have what Zipler called a socioeconomic filter. In urban environments, humans pick and choose which plants get to keep growing, and will plant new trees, which alters the forest growth. As well, they clean up fallen trees instead of letting them decompose naturally, which means that nutrients are not taken back into the soil. In rural areas, these human disturbances do not occur and does cause a difference between urban and rural forest succession. In urban parks, the ecosystem is more isolated, which means there's fewer natural seed dispersals from other areas and more seed dispersed by human activity like plant dumping and footwear, where seeds get stuck in the grooves of footwear and get dispersed when people walk around. These factors will influence the number of native and non-native species found in the forest. Zipler determined that large urban cities tend to have more non-native species growing in their landscapes than smaller cities, and most likely rural areas will have more native species than non-native. Rural areas will not have human-caused seed dispersal and tend to have more natural seed dispersal from neighboring forests. All in all, succession seems to change depending on the forest's surrounding environment, and Point Pleasant Park's succession will have differed if it was not surrounded by urban influence.
Another major storm would likely impact the forest community differently than Hurricane Juan did, depending on several factors. The storm's intensity, duration, and any preventative measures taken by humans would definitely all play a role. The stage of succession at the time of impact is also crucial. If a storm were to hit now while Point Pleasant Park is still recovering, the damage would be more severe and distinct compared to a storm occurring 100 years from now when the ecosystem had time to stabilize. The younger trees currently growing may be more flexible and resilient to strong winds, potentially influencing how the forest responds. Given these factors, another storm could lead to a shift in dominant species once again. We would like to acknowledge that previous students from 2004 to 2024, as well as Dr. Allison Schmidt, Dr. Christine Beauchamp, and any other instructors involved for conducting the data collection and performing the data analysis.